Sup D&D bags, my name's Tom and I'm back again today to give you my top 5 tips for world building in your roleplay campaigns. So moving straight ahead into tip number 1, we're going to be looking at the scope. Now when I'm talking about scope, I'm talking about the size of the story you're looking to tell. So let's say you sat down, you want to DM a session for your players, and you've thought a little bit about the story. Now if your story is relatively small scale in terms of you have to stop a local warlord from terrorising the local villages, then in terms of the world building, you're only going to need to flesh out a few villages within the surrounding area. However, if you're on a quest to stop a lich from taking over the entire world, you need to think much broader. You need to start thinking of countries, you need to start thinking of major cities, etc. So starting with the scope, you really need to think about, okay, how big is my story that I'm looking to tell and how far does that span? Perhaps at the beginning they're only going to be spending most of their time in a few villages, however they might have to journey later on in the quest to another massive town. So you've got to think about these places beforehand and sort of flesh them out. Again, this goes for different planes of existence as well. If you feel like your players are going to actually wind up in a different dimension, a different plane of existence, then you need to start thinking about those dimensions as well. Are you going to take them straight from the D&D book, or are you going to flesh them out slightly differently, give them different properties? So the scope's all about you and your players. If the story is massive, you're going to have to start thinking about countries and continents and islands, etc. If it's quite small scale, start thinking about the individual villages. Now, there are pros and cons to both. The pros for having a smaller story are you can actually put in individual NPCs and characters within these villages and really flesh them out and start thinking about them. However, obviously when you're going much broader in terms of countries, continents, towns and cities, you can't do that so much. On the other hand, if you're telling a huge story that encompasses the entire world, it's really epic and your players will get into it, and it's great for them to see repercussions of their actions kind of reverberate throughout the entire world or countries or cities. So once you've thought about the scope for your story and perhaps the relevant world size to encompass that, then we're going to move on to tip number 2, state of the world. So what I mean by state of the world is that if you've gone on a small scale and you have a couple of villages that your story is going to be taking place over, what are the state are they in? Are they at war? Are they at peace? Is there a variation? Is it on the brink of war? Is there a lot of tension between these villages? What's the atmosphere like? This is really important for setting the scene. Now if these villages, let's say, are on the brink of war and there's a huge amount of tension between them, the players are going to be nervous. Any of their actions could tip them over the edge and push it into a full-blown war between these villages. And the same applies for a much broader story as well. So what is the state of the world? Sure, some countries will be at peace and they won't be doing anything. However, other countries might be actively at war, or they may actually be on the verge of going to war. Now the thing you need to be careful here is don't just put countries at war for the sake of them being at war. What does that add to the story that you're trying to tell? If your story is regarding some sort of local menace or a monster or a creature, how is that going to affect those villages? Perhaps if there's tension between the two villages and this monster's threatening the survival, would those two villages lay down their arms and band together to overcome this threat? Or would it push them over the edge and cause a full-blown conflict while this threat is still there? So we really need to think about how can this atmosphere, how can this tension, or how can this atmosphere of peace add to the story? Don't forget, if countries are at peace or villages are at peace, it's easy to travel between them and the players won't feel hampered at all. However, if there are strict borderlines, the players are going to really struggle and they might need identification papers or anything like that to get over the border. So let's think about that for a second. If your story is about your players having to assassinate a doppelganger of a king in another country, then yeah, having some tension between the two countries they're travelling between would be great, because they would have to sneak into the other country, which adds to the story. So again, really think about your story here and how this atmosphere between villages, countries, worlds, planes of existence, how those relationships can really add to the story. Moving straight on to tip number 3, we're going to be talking about relationships and history. Now on a small scale, relationships and history can mean literally relationships and history between characters, between NPCs within the same village. So on a small scale, we can really flesh out these relationships. Perhaps the barkeep has a real crush on the gravekeeper, or there's a real tension between two brothers of a certain clan within the village. There's lots of ways that you can use this, but again, it's really important to make sure these relationships have some impact on the story, otherwise it's pointless. Now on a much broader scale, these relationships in history can mean between countries. Yes, the state of the world may be peace, However, two countries may have a history of long warfare that's only just come to an end. Or perhaps the king from one country has offered his daughter's hand in marriage to ensure peace between those two countries. It can be anything that you want it to be. Now, this aspect of relationships in history can permeate the entire world of D&D, from a sort of village level to a personal level to a country level, but also between races and classes. So perhaps monks or bards are looked down upon, while the other classes are revered. This kind of thing can really add some conflict for your players, and again, it should really add to the story. So if you're doing these kind of things, make sure to think how that's going to affect your players, and is that going to add to the story? If it's just going to be a pain for your players to do what the main quest is, then why put it in there at all? So the important thing here is for the players to kind of discover this world as they're going along, and making sure these relationships, history, state of the world doesn't actually hamper them from telling the story that they want to go on. So to sum up, relationships and history are fantastic for adding a little bit of flavour to your D&D world. However, you need to make sure it adds to the story as always, rather than takes away. So if it's just going to make it difficult for your players to do anything because all of their classes are kind of looked down upon or something like that, then what's the point of doing that? Make sure it adds to the story. Make sure there's going to be conflict within the group as well. Maybe some of the group are well revered, some of the group aren't, so they have to kind of band together and figure out a way of getting through particular obstacles that you've set for them. One thing to bear in mind is that for everything that's looked up upon, there's always going to be a flip side. So in one country or one village, it may be really revered to be a paladin. However, in another village, another country, another continent, it could be the other way around. Paladins are seen as the lowest of the low. They're seen as pointless. So again, making sure your players feel empowered in one area and then not so powerful in another area really adds to that dynamic, and it can add that extra shift that if the players are moving from country to country, village to village, they're going to experience a story, they're going to experience different cultures as they move. And that brings me on to my fourth point, cultures and ideologies. Now, similar to relationships in history, culture and ideologies can really add to the story. So different cultures have different ways of doing things. Different cultures actually have different ideologies. So when the players are moving through this world, how are they experiencing these new cultures, and how can that add to the story? So let's say the players are searching for a wizard. Now, in the country they've previously been in, or the village they've previously been in, there's not many magic users, so they can really use their arcana checks to pinpoint the location of this person. However, when this wizard flees across the border, or goes to another village or city, perhaps they go to somewhere filled with magic. Places where magic shops and arcana users around every corner, so it becomes really, really difficult, and the players have to rely on their investigation skills to try and find them instead. See, that's the kind of thing that adds to the story, but also adds to the world dynamic. And what I mean by that is the players can get a real feel for different cultures within the world that you've created. However, it adds to the story in a way that it will make it more difficult, make it slightly easier, make it different, essentially. And I know that can be difficult in D&D when the players have their own agency and they're going around doing their own thing. However, having a basic concept, again, of the scope of your story and where they might be able to go, that it gives you the power to adapt to what they're doing. And again, if you give these places different cultures, different ideologies, they're going to find that interesting. They're going to find it interesting. It's going to add a new obstacle or perhaps a new challenge in front of the players that they're going to have to overcome. So moving along to the last tip I'm going to give you, probably the most important tip of all, how do the players fit in? Now, before any campaign, I would 100% recommend reading through your players' bios, their histories, very, very thoroughly. Once you have an idea of where they've come from, where they've been, you can actually add those places into the story. And I feel like adding those places in the story adds a lot more because the stakes are raised. Let's say if one of the players has a wife and child, if you add them into the world that they're exploring, then yeah, that does add tension. Because if they get on the wrong side of the wrong people, they might actually be able to take their wife and kid hostage. Again, this works in a way that the players actually feel invested in the world because the backstory they've written is actually in there. So adding these places in from their backstories really adds investment to the story and the world as a whole, gets them more involved. They know the city, they know the area, so perhaps they have an advantage when they're looking around for things there, or they can direct the party through the town because they know it. So again, if one of the party members has a history with the town, has been run out by the guards because of their misadventures, and perhaps they definitely don't want to go there. And if they have a secret or they have a family there, perhaps they don't want the other members of the party knowing about it. However, if their adventure leads them through their town or leads them through the village where their family is, then they're going to feel on edge because they don't want to get their family involved with this adventure or this quest that they've got on. Or perhaps they do want them to get involved and the party can go and stop at that person's house. There's loads of things you can think about, but making sure your players have investment in the world by adding their backstories or adding the threads of their backstories into the world as a whole is a great way to do that. And again, it also saves you a lot of time of thinking up these ideas. If someone's come up with a great backstory for a town they used to be in, then use it. There's no need of having to think about it from scratch. You've got the basis of that town, that city, that country already there. Just use it. And that sums up my 5 tips for world building today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like the video, comment down below with your world building ideas or stupid or crazy ideas that you've got from your players to put in your world. And be sure to check out my channel for many more videos. I've got my Item of the Week series. I'm also doing a few more of these GM sort of DM tips videos as well. So be sure to keep an eye out, and thanks for joining me.